I am very thrilled to introduce to you two speakers right now in a bit of a new format. We hope is going to be interactive. So be awake and ready to ask and shoot your questions and debate. In this session, we will explore geopolitics, diplomacy, the role of science in this area, but also the unique selling proposition or the special role that Switzerland can play in complex geopolitical context. And right now we want to focus on the Arctic. I'm very pleased to introduce first Professor Madeleine Herren. She is a historian, a specialist of diplomatic and multilateral relations, a professor of the University of Basel, where she was until recently the director of the Institute for European Global Studies. And she will be presenting first and then discuss with Ambassador Alexandra Baumann, who is a career diplomat, and at the Swiss Federal Department for Foreign Affairs. She is responsible, amongst many things, for polar regions. She's our representative in the Arctic Council and in the ATCM, the Antarctic Treaty Committee meeting. So she is our polar diplomat in Bern. So I am very much looking forward to their discussion, and I really encourage you to also challenge them a little bit and to think about what you want to ask them. So the floor is yours, Madeleine, to start.
Thank you very much, Danielle, for this kind introduction. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I'm especially pleased that I have the opportunity to start the discussion with Ambassador Baumann also. Thank you very much for this opportunity. So on my first slide, you can see an excerpt from the Arctic Council website 5 years ago. And it announces an interview with Switzerland's then polar ambassador and presents Switzerland as an observer state in the Arctic Council. Switzerland's position as a vertical polar nation, this was exciting news, especially for a historian interested in the history of international organizations. My presentation is based on 3 assumptions. First, Arctic Council and Antarctic Treaty systems. They are the model and the prototype for the international order of the 21st century. Although I am not going into the details of these treaty systems, just let me say it's very important that these treaty systems are outside the United Nations. My second assumption is, in shaping these new forms of international relations, science and diplomacy are and will remain closely intertwined. And probably you expect what I'm saying now, since historians always say that nothing is new. And this is exactly what I do. It's indeed not new at all. The close connection between diplomacy and science is a characteristic feature of the history of Swiss multilateralism, which dates back to the 19th century. So even before World War I, Switzerland became the seat of first generation of international organizations. Just to take an example, the Telecommunication Union goes back to the 19th century. And Switzerland was a meeting place for international congresses of all kinds. And I will focus on this second part, the international congresses. I therefore suggest a little bit a different narrative. So not a history of great polar expeditions, not a history of great heroes in the eternal ice, not even a history of Swiss polar research, because you know this history much better than I do. But I would suggest the history of Switzerland as an information hub. I would like to emphasize the valuable role that the exchange, access to, and preservation of scientific information can play in shaping international relations. And if you are ready to replace the word information with the term data, I may be able to convince you that the journey from a Swiss characteristic of the 19th century to the 21st century science diplomacy is not as long as it may seem. With that, we leave this beautiful view of the Arctic landscape, turning to Geneva. You will find the term science diplomacy mentioned in many publications. For example, also in the newest edition of the Swiss Foreign Policy Strategy. The same document, so the Swiss Foreign Policy Strategy, also mentions GESTA, the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator. GESTA is an independent institution founded by the Swiss Federal Council and the Canton and City of Geneva and became operative in 2020. Together with other similar centers, for example, the US Center for Science Diplomacy, a foundation of AAAS, GESTA assumes that science has an increasing value for diplomatic decision-making. So it's not just a collaboration in between diplomacy and science, it's also influencing the way diplomacy has to be done. Within this rather UN-focused debates, GESTA wants also to save La Genève Internationale, so the meeting place where budget cuts made the whole situation much more complicated. Within these rather UN-focused debates, polar research lost a bit of its importance. This is remarkable because polar research played a very important role in the development of the label science diplomacy. This term, science diplomacy, was introduced as a policy arena in 2010 by the most powerful players in global science policy, namely the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS, and the British Royal Society. And in this moment, and under the guidance of these powerful organizations, the Antarctic Treaty became a paradigm of how the governance of international spaces could serve as a kind of a laboratory of peaceful new forms of global governance. As is often the case, a historical example serves as somehow the empirical evidence for the accuracy of this prediction. The reference example is the geophysical year, which in 1957-58 saw both sides conducting research during the Cold War, the American side and the Russian side. And since the next international polar year is approaching and planned for 2032-33, we have to discuss whether or not the Cold War reference, so 57-58, is indeed useful. For the moment, it is important to note that the work of global research collaborations are a key element in the vision of new forms of global governance. And for that vision, the international polar years are crucial and even more important than specific topics of polar research. So how to come together in a really huge global arena. Now, after this publication in 2010, when we thought that science diplomacy is really the new key term for saving access to a more peaceful, cooperative world, AAAS and Royal Society published a new report in February 2025. And the title itself announced the end of almost all illusions. Science diplomacy in an era of disruption. This is already a very explicit title. And science in this publication was not anymore in the driver's seat of a peaceful form of global governance. The new analysis of the situation emphasized the increasing importance of economic factors. And in addition, the report suggested even a redefinition of the cooperation between science and diplomacy. Now, it goes even further. Within this rationale, the key message is do not blur the lines between scientists and diplomats. Even more, the report makes the clear statement that science should not have the function of policy advice. Even more, science, I quote, should not be used as cover for political decisions that are made on the basis of value. End of quotation. Rather, the report highlights respect for the boundaries between scientific evidence and policy making. And diplomats and scientists in this report have very clearly differentiated interests. Diplomats follow national interests, while scientists are doing research beyond and across borders. The statement of being different is mentioned as the main reason why a dialogue between diplomacy and science is urgently needed. And as you can see, we are doing exactly the right thing now, today. In this report, the focus is on the limits of science diplomacy. So the discussion has really changed significantly within these few years, between 2010 and 2025. So in February, this report was published, and it mirrors somehow the situation last year. And in the new report, science is rather a soft policy tool on the side of the global commons. So, and then the Arctic provides some sort of an example how a soft law regime could be imagined. And still the Arctic is one of the two case studies. However, it's interesting to see what the second case study in this report is. The second case study raises the question of the private sector, asking whether states and IGO, I quote, will start threatening supranational companies as de facto nation states. Or, to put it bluntly, do we need now tech ambassadors in future to ensure that diplomats and scientists have access to satellite systems, GPS data, and other information technologies, both increasingly in the possession of private-owned companies? Denmark was the first nation state to launch tech diplomacy, so this is the abbreviation they made, a tech ambassador with an office, of course, in Palo Alto, opened in 2017. And the question indeed is whether science diplomacy has come to an end. All the more these companies are probably indeed more powerful than especially a small state. Within the whole debate about AI-generated big data and fast-changing political constellations, a historical dimension is almost completely missing in the whole debate. However, I believe that taking an ahistorical approach is a missed opportunity to highlight a distinctive Swiss characteristic in today's discourse, namely the country's long history of what I would call scientific internationalism. So from the outset, so going back to the 19th century, polar research was a competitive race for resources between neighboring countries and big powers. And Switzerland was neither neighboring nor powerful. Interestingly, this weak position turned to advantage when access to global markets changed under the condition of new, faster communication technologies, let's say trains, telegraphy, because that enhanced the need of sharing information across borders. So in the second half of the 19th century, Switzerland became the host of a first generation of international organizations and the focal point of a scientific internationalism. So I can make it a little bit more empirical, what that means. That means, for example, that the invitation for an international scientific conference, let's say the geographers are doing international congress, this invitation came via the diplomatic channels to the Federal Council, and then the Federal Council arranged for Swiss scientists to be officially sent to congresses abroad, or even better, the Federal Council supported that the scientific congress was invited to Switzerland also via diplomatic channels. And you see, of course, the consequences of this behavior, namely international congresses enhanced the small states' visibility and turned transnational networks to politically powerful hubs. Now, let's look into the first International Polar Conference. That took place in Hamburg in 1879. But there was no way that a polar policy shaped by Bismarck could have succeeded in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War. And then you have also a Tsarist empire where polar research is very strong. But then things fell into place very smoothly. And the preparatory conference took place first in Bern and after that in St. Petersburg. And when Heinrich von Wild, you see the picture, became the organizer of the very first International Polar Year. Wild is not really well known. I don't know whether you knew this name. Probably not. It's not really well known. He was a meteorologist with an interesting dual role. He was a professor at the University of Bern and the director of the St. Petersburg Observatory. So he was a Tsarist civil servant. He had excellent contacts to diplomats, researchers across every imaginable disciplinary and even social borders. Wild had never published anything on polar research or taken part in an expedition. He had no diplomatic functions, no access to funding, and so far we can see no financial interest in the discovery of the polar regions. But his contribution as lobbyist and networker was absolutely crucial. He shaped international gatherings in the fields of geography. That was where the first Polar International Congresses happened. And he indeed helped transforming geopolitical expansion. This was the aim of polar research at this time. So he helped transforming geopolitical expansion into a scientific discourse. And I'm aware that the alleged transformation from a geopolitical conquest to scientific discourse has not secured peace at all. However, with the International Polar Year being systematically relaunched in specific time periods, global cooperation had to be every time newly negotiated and implemented. And such talks were obviously necessary whenever geopolitical developments and structural innovation coincide. So, for example, in the Second Polar Year in the 1930s, the focus was on negotiating transit corridors and spheres of influence through the use of aircraft. Through the lens of the Second International Polar Year, we have a good example for the disruptive elimination of distances through radio communication, but we have also Mussolini's clear interest in flights over the Arctic. The preparation of the Second International Polar Year confirms again the role of Swiss cooperation beyond having really huge expeditions. They were some, but not really huge expeditions. So, for example, Mittelholzer's aerial photographs for Amundsen are still a very interesting source. One could even go so far as to say that the success of Swiss scientific internationalism also shaped the polar landscape. A whole series of mountains and glaciers were named after Swiss glaciologists in the 1930s, first of all in Antarctica. The significance of the poles as a crisis indicator became even clearer in the third polar year, which was named as International Geopolitics Physical Year. What was interpreted as a sign of peace during the Cold War, namely the cooperation between Americans and Russians in a multilateral scientific context, had also, first of all, a military justification. It should not be forgotten that the geophysical year coincided with the Sputnik shock, and that data collected at the poles had ultimately become necessary due to the new military technologies and the use of satellites. In 1961, in the aftermath of the geophysical year, the picture of Swiss flag dressed in the Antarctic circulated in the Swiss media. This patriotic imagery was the documentation of this close collaboration with American scientists and institutions. But what can we take out from this 57, 58 polar year? Beyond the fact that military interests are involved, beyond the fact of a close American collaboration. I think there is another additional topic which we should discuss. When the Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1961, the world has changed in a substantial way because many of the former colonies had become now sovereign states, first of all, in Africa. And these new sovereign states were not happy at all that the whole polar research was outside the reach of the United Nations, and the whole treaty system only granted access to those states which could make high investments. The Swiss UN observer at this time documented these developments very carefully, as we know from the diplomatic documents of Switzerland do this. And I like to quote this fact since it was the first female ambassador of Switzerland, Francesca Pometta, who mentioned these tensions. But since then, decolonizing polar research is an issue and will probably gain its importance in the next polar year planned for 2032. Now, let's go into the question of media attention or how much polar research is addressing a broader public. So I'm picking up also what Thomas Zurbuchen has said, that it is the silence that we have to fear. Since polar research was and is inexpensive, the results of media attention is rather surprising. Between 2010 and 2019, Swiss-German newspapers discussed polar research in only few articles. And in the previous decades, between 1990 and 1999, the media attention was even a bit lower, although the foundation of the Arctic Council happened in this time frame. Of course, these figures do not provide a precise picture. Maybe OCR was wrong, maybe the large language model was not working, maybe climate research is more attractive as an umbrella term. I was just looking into the newspapers with the term Polarforschung. So don't believe in the numbers at all, but what we can take out is at least that media attention has not increased. In fact, it has declined compared to the interwar period and is even slightly below the attention threshold of the late 19th century. This was, at least to me, quite surprising because that sent somehow mixed signals. During the first and second international polar years, media coverage was a common means of mobilizing third-party funding, and the media celebrated the roles of sponsors. The role of third-party funding, of course, remained crucial until today. But after World War II, the financing of big science changed and state-funded scientific and other organizations became the main players. So preparations for the next polar year show now that satellites, large computer capacities, and drone technologies are now required, which are no longer in the domain exclusively of the national players. So given that big science is getting even bigger, the question is indeed whether tech ambassadors will become necessary and whether polar research will gain another dimension. For example, whether it is useful to include more IT specialists or to enhance the research community in the direction of IT specialists. Perhaps this is even more important than those doing the fieldwork. Who knows? The question is, which institution are these days involved? And as you can see from this slide, only showing the stakeholders involved in the planning of the next International Polar Year, it is quite difficult to find a way around these many, many stakeholders involved. So how can we ensure that scientific data collection financed by taxpayers' money remains accessible in a sustainable manner? And how can we maintain the willingness to provide funding when it is becoming less and less anchored in the political discourse? In view of rising political tensions, the question arises as to whether the Antarctic Treaty and the Arctic Council are crisis-proof institutional platforms, or whether belief in the mediating role of science is proving to be just an illusion. Now, I felt it was important to leave the perspective of the very small state in order to gain out-of-the-box view. And of course, my goal is still to test the value of scientific multilateralism. So let us examine some of these levels of conflict from the outside perspective, namely the British parliamentary debate on UK's polar strategy. In the House of Lords debate in 2023-24, the British discourse presents a rather dark picture. Based on the influence of the geopolitical situation in the Arctic Council and the Antarctic Treaties, the experts propose a realignment of the regimes and the new coalitions that are more bilaterally oriented and not anymore multilaterally. The future of the Arctic Council is uncertain, although re-engaging Russia would have positive effects for further scientific cooperation and data exchange. In both cases, the Arctic and the Antarctic scientific cooperation remains crucial. Things have changed. Research is now a soft power facing military and economic considerations, and they are, of course, much stronger. For the polar regions, the idea of the cooperation of the willing dominates now the political debate. And this cooperation of the willing works even better on a more technical level, as has been said in these debates. So the position is not that far away from developing scientific multilateralism any further. Now, when we go to the House of Commons, to a more recent debate, you can see all the problems condensed. So dual-use problems and the increase of actors, with China mentioned in the Antarctic, consensus-based fora that are under pressure since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the US budget cuts, which will influence polar research as an international endeavor. Research could be misused as first step in commercial exploitation. This is the seismic surveys by Russia as an example, and the desperate need of additional coalitions. Still, there is the next polar year. And of course, I had no idea that the author of these lines will be present here. Professor Dame Jane Francis suggested the vision for this next polar year. And as you can see, it's a challenging vision, but it says also it has this dynamic, this positive dynamic, and is a vision what should be done in the situation we have today, because the instruments are somehow available, but it has to be done within this very complex geopolitical situation. Now, let's conclude. To me, it is indeed a fundamental change of framework conditions for polar research, what we can see. Science and diplomacy needs on both sides an exchange on the question whether we could continue with existing international framework, or whether it is more useful to adapt the whole time frame of activities, perhaps not multilateral, but perhaps it's easier to do a bilateral cooperation. We have to talk about priorities. So the participation in the next International Polar Year will be, and I'm saying that just as a historian, but the cooperation will be crucial, because all these International Polar Years, they serve as a sort of a pattern where you can see that things are changing within this huge framework of cooperation. Now, I know historians having visions, a bit of a problem, but I try. I'm pretty sure that we should shift the focus from data collection to ensuring data access. And this presentation of data access, of open access to reliable data, that could be some sort of a new form of Swiss scientific multilateralism. And this is indeed a valuable offer or a valuable platform, because in all these debates, also in the UK, not only in tiny little Switzerland, in all these debates, the availability of data is absolutely crucial. And these are kind of the discussion point I would offer that we can go into. Just let me say one little point. I think this kind of dialogue is very important, but it's not enough. So having dialogues should be part of a regular kind of mechanism of exchange, and probably I would say the way how we search for a new narrative should also be the topic of a research project. Thank you very much.